A continent at the dawn of discovery. When Europeans first came here, they called it the New World. But this was not an uninhabited virgin wilderness. The people who lived here had been settled in this land for more than 10,000 years. They had learned from their ancestors a way of life which was entwined, practically and spiritually, with the plants and animals which shared this generous land.
I have taken the eagle for my bird, because he is the greatest of all birds. He is strong, for he flies where no man can reach him. In his feathers, white and black, we see day and night. When he spreads his wings and soars aloft, he breathes deep with the joy of well-being. The eagle is myself. I sing his song at sunrise.
The first Europeans who crossed the Atlantic saw the newfound land of North America as an obstacle, blocking a westward seaway to the riches of the Orient. But their arrival meant that America would encounter a new people whose ideas and attitudes would reshape the natural history of an entire continent. The eastern seaboard of America is a flyway for migrating birds. Christopher Columbus had seen such flocks skimming over the sea and knew that he was at last approaching land. But he believed that the sea had carried him to Asia and that he would find silks and spices from the East Indies. Later seafarers, Cabot, Verrazzano, Cartier, explored the eastern seaboard of North America, understanding that it was a new world which they could exploit for profit. Behind this shoreline lay 3,000 miles of rich and varied landscapes. In time, the encounter between two old worlds, each new to the other, would make the United States and Canada we know today. The Spanish and French encountered this land first, and both tried to reshape it in their own image. New Spain, New France. But here, on the outer banks of today's North Carolina, almost a century after Columbus, came the first settlement of the culture that would eventually prevail. The year was 1584. Sir Walter Raleigh claimed a vast territory for England. He called the land Virginia, in honor of Elizabeth, his Virgin Queen. 3 years later, 150 English men, women, and children came to settle. The sandbanks captured a large part of their supplies. They settled on an island called Roanoke. Here was a village of the Secretan tribe, who they described as very handsome, goodly people, mannerly and civil as any in Europe. The English governor, John White, was an artist. With naturalist Thomas Harriot, he documented the resources of the new territory.
Farther into the main, we found country more inhabited with people, and of greater policy and larger dominion, with greater towns and houses. We found the soil to be fatter, the trees to grow thinner, fine grasses as good as ever we saw in England, and more abundance of beasts.
By growing thinner, the English meant that the trees were more widely spaced. They didn't realize that this was due to management by the Indians. Animals like deer need succulent grasses, and the Indians thinned out the woodlands with regular burnings, opening up the soil to sunlight. The English saw food and profit, but believed this was a purely natural bounty.
Deer skins, dressed after the manner of chamois, or undressed, are to be had from the natural inhabitants, thousands yearly by way of traffic for trifles.
Turkeys, too, benefited from Indian burning and land management, and were as important as deer in their economy. White and Harriot went back to England with glowing reports of the game available to drum up supplies and more colonists.
Turkey cocks, turkey hens, stock doves, partridges, cranes, herons, and in winter great store of swans and geese, although we have seen and eaten of many more kinds.
Although some animals here were familiar to the colonists, many species were totally strange. No marsupial, like the possum, had ever been seen in Europe.
There is a beast they call arucan, much like a badger, but useth to live on trees as squirrels do.
That local Indian name became raccoon. Unlike the squirrel, it's just as much at home foraging in fresh water for crayfish as in trees for fruit. These adaptable creatures would be met by later explorers across virtually the whole continent. But there were other, more menacing creatures which the colonists did not mention. They didn't want to spoil the picture of a virgin paradise. It was 3 years before White was able to get back to his colony, and the men, women, and children were vanished. There was no trace of his wife and baby, the first English child born in America. One word had been carved on the stockade of their village, Croatoan, the name of an Indian tribe. Their fate remains a mystery. Their story is lost in this strange landscape. Their rigid walled community on the water's edge had failed, but that was the pattern that would be tried again and again. John White had wanted to establish a second colony to the north of Roanoke in an area of Virginia he had partly explored, a place the Indians called the Great Bay of Shells, Chesapeake. This would prove to be the largest estuary in North America, and it was into this bay that 3 English vessels of the Virginia Company sailed in the spring of 1607, carrying another cargo of colonists. As they passed the spits of land that flank the entrance to Chesapeake, even they must have seen the abundance of the bay, for above their heads wheeled great flocks of royal terns, which thrive on these rich tidal waters. The Virginia Company's sales promotion to the colonists must have seemed entirely justified.
heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation, were it fully manured and inhabited by industrious people.
They eventually entered one of the huge rivers that empties into the bay. They named it the James River, for James had succeeded the Virgin Queen.
We are set down 80 miles within a river for sweetness of water, and so stored with sturgeons and other sweet fish as no man's fortune has ever possessed the like.
A wooded peninsula in the James River offered a secure landing and a suitable site for building their town. They called it Jamestown. They began by building a fortress, for they had no intention of becoming a second Roanoke. This time, they were here to stay. In those days, the bald eagle was a familiar sight. With graceful ease, it patrolled the estuary, feeding on its abundant life. This was the bird that would in time be adopted as the emblem of the new Americans. But not until they had learned, like the eagle, independence. For the eagles, spring provides ample food to raise their families. The rivers and creeks are full of fish moving up to spawn. Normally, eagles rear only 2 chicks, but for this eagle, Chesapeake Bay can support 3 youngsters. The bald eagle was held in high regard by all Native Americans, for whom it was a powerful symbol of their view of nature.
He is the father, and all the little birds are his children. He is strong, for he flies where no man can reach him. He flies so high that his spirit is close to those that dwell in the sky, close even to the Great Spirit, the breath maker, the giver of life.
Sacred, too, was the great blue heron. Respected by the tribes of Chesapeake, it was allowed to raise its chicks in peace. These youngsters, like the eagle chicks, are being fed on the rich abundance of fish and crustaceans that breed in the shallow waters. A blue crab, caught in the estuary and now partially digested, is eagerly demolished in the security of the heron rookery. Herons, eagles, native people, and the newcomers to Chesapeake all shared in the spring harvest of the bay. This natural productivity is fed by the huge salt marshes that fringe the bay and the rivers running into it. The rich sediments wash off the land, feeding the profuse growth of cordgrass, the basic pasture of the marsh. The tidal surge flushes nutrients out of the salt marsh into the open waters of the bay, where a rain of particles feeds worms and shellfish. The stingray grubs out clams buried in the mud, but the colonists preferred shellfish that were easier to find.
Oysters there be in whole banks and beds, and those of the best. I have seen some more than a foot in length. In the large sound near the sea are multitudes of fish, banks of oysters, and a great many crabs, and the toadfish, which will swell till it be like to burst when it comes into the air.
Wading over the shell-strewn reefs, the settlers soon discovered that the shallow waters of Chesapeake had a seemingly boundless capacity for supporting life. Every crevice revealed strange and diverse creatures, sponges, tunicates, and curiosities such as the spider crab that adorns itself for camouflage. The spider crab is prettier than a toadfish, but no better to eat. But there was plenty of choice for the colonists. Then as now, the blue crab was one of the most prized foods of Chesapeake Bay. The local Indians collected them in large numbers by baited line or in baskets and hand nets. They were even collected from shallow pools by hand. When the colonists saw those powerful claws in action, they may have had doubts about that technique. Late spring is the time when the blue crabs gather in the middle of the bay to mate. Pairing can only happen immediately after a female has emerged from her shell. To be successful, a male must ambush, then hang on to his prospective mate. The very act of being seized by a male prompts the internal changes in the female that will lead to her undoing her impenetrable armor. Immobilized by his powerful embrace, the female crab is protected from predators and other males. She's also sustained with oxygen in the current of water constantly fanned over her by her attentive partner. Eventually, she begins to withdraw from her shell, first the claws and eye stalks, then her fleshy body. The old shell splits, and the female now uses the male's body to brace herself as she finally struggles free, discarding her outgrown shell. Only now, 3 days after pairing, can the crabs begin to mate. Encouraged and protected by her partner's claws, the female turns on her back, exposing her eggs to the milt released by her mate. So ensuring that another generation of blue crabs will be added to the food chain of the bay. Crabs were not the only spring diet for the colonists. Large shoals of striped bass made their way past Jamestown to spawn. The paintings and diaries of the first English settlers recorded their unexpected catches. Rockfish, as they were called, grew large, but they were accompanied by even larger fish, up to 14 feet long, sturgeon.
Rows of the said sturgeon will make caviar, and caviar whale conditioned is worth 40 pounds per 100-pound weight. We had more sturgeon than could be devoured by man or dog.
Unlike the settlers, who simply reached out and took the food that fell into their hands, the Indians harvested this bounty in a systematic way. They caught larger fish with spears, but they also built weirs across the rivers to trap migrating shoals. At night, fires carried in dugout canoes attracted the fish within range of their hand nets. The colonists found the easiest catch often tasted the worst.
There be two sorts of sea crab. One our people call the king crab, and they are taken off the shoal waters from off the shore, a dozen at a time, hanging upon one another's tail. They are a foot in length and half a foot in breadth, having legs and a long tail. The Indians rarely eat this sort.
The colonists had been catching horseshoe crabs. Not true crabs at all. They are members of an ancient group more closely related to spiders. The horseshoe crabs come here to breed, to lay their eggs above the reach of the highest spring tides. This mass gathering, synchronized by the spring full moon, can attract as many as 100,000 crabs to a half-mile stretch of beach. The eggs laid by one wave of crabs are churned up by the next. This is an invitation to armies of laughing gulls to rally from the surrounding marshes. Soon after high tide, the egg-laying ends and the crabs try to get back into the water, or they'll be stranded. The gulls eat their fill, but as they begin to disperse, the beach is overwhelmed by a new invasion from the south. These are migrants, red knot, sanderling and turnstones, moving up the Atlantic from wintering grounds in South America. Their long journey has been timed so that they arrive on these beaches at the peak of the crab's egg laying. 2 weeks of gluttony on this beach can double their body weight. Enough reserves to carry them to their nesting grounds in the high Arctic. Once a cache of eggs is found, it's jealously guarded. The waders resume their migration northwards. The shore is left to the gulls. With the start of the summer heat, the Indians also moved away from the coast, but the English stayed. Virginia was supposed to be Earth's only paradise. As summer advanced, the colonists learned the reality. The oppressive heat took the first settlers by surprise. But they wouldn't move from their town and their harbor. They would sweat it out. The eagle chicks have grown fast on the spring bonanza. Now they have to learn how to fly free. Saving their energy during the heat of the day, they wait for the cool of the evening breeze to exercise the muscles of their wings. Soon they will escape from the nesting tree and find shade and food further afield. The English were not like eagles or Indians. They were urban people, jewelers and glassmakers, perfumers and silkmen. Surrounded by a fetid marsh whose air was hot and wet and windless, they began to die. They had carried their own death. Diseases which plagued the old world had come with them. Typhoid and smallpox raged through the colony. And they had no crops. For the Indians, summer was a time of celebration. Their green corn feast was a festival of spiritual renewal, a thanksgiving for the growth of their crops. Maize was their staple diet, and as the settlers clearly noted, was grown in an orderly fashion. Although Indian corn had been taken back by the Spanish and was now widely cultivated in the warmer Mediterranean countries, it was almost unknown in England. Here on the east coast, as was common among Indians, it was grown alongside other crops. Beans were grown up the maize stems and a variety of squashes planted at the base. John Smith, the colonist leader, knew that it was only the Indians who were keeping them alive, even though the Indians were supposed to be savages.
It pleased God after a while to send those people who were our mortal enemies to relieve us with victuals such as bread, corn, fish, and flesh in great plenty. Otherwise we should have perished.
With autumn, the stifling heat and humidity of summer begins to die away. For the local Indians, this was the season of cohonks, their name for the countless thousands of geese that pour out of the northern sky. For the snow geese, these salt marshes of Chesapeake are the end of a 2,000-mile migration from their summer breeding grounds in the high Arctic of Canada. Here they feed on roots and tubers of the salt marsh plants. Not all of them stay here. Some move further down the coast. For the Indians, the arrival of the geese was an annual godsend, a spectacle as predictable as autumn itself. For the settlers, the sight and sound of these blizzards of snow geese filling the air renewed their original hope that here, in the paradise of Virginia, life would be easy after all. The sheer abundance of great birds was dazzling. The colonists didn't understand that the geese were driven on by winter. They didn't know about winter in this new world.
The river, which was wont before this time of the year to be plentiful, had not now a fish to be seen in it, and albeit we laboured and hauled our net 20 times a day and night, yet we took not so much as would content half the fishermen.
Of course, fish were still there if you knew where to find them. But to the English, surviving winter was even harder than summer.
So excessive are the frosts that one night the river froze over almost from bank to bank. There died from the frost some fish in the river, which when taken were very good.
The early years of this first permanent English settlement were disastrous. By the end of the winter of 1609, most of the original 105 colonists were dead. As a commercial venture, the Virginia Company was a catastrophe. So they sent more boats with more settlers. 8,000 were sent by the company, 6,000 perished. Desperate for something that could be sent back for sale in England, one settler began cultivating a plant grown by the Indians. They called it upperwock. John Rolfe imported some seeds of a more robust variety grown in the Spanish Indies. There they called it tobacco. The settlers began to leave their infested little town and establish large plantations. Tobacco came too late to save the Virginia Company, but it saved the colony. It became a cash crop. With it were sown the seeds of a new attitude to the land which would shape the future of America. In the New World, the soil would grow money. For the Indians, tobacco was a sacred plant. In its smoke, their thoughts were carried to the spirit world. For generations, tobacco had been an integral part of their lives, invoking divine medicine, inducing goodwill and meditation. For the Indians of North America, upperwock symbolized their long-standing relationship with the natural world. As European settlements spread around the shores of Chesapeake, the traditional lives of the coastal tribes were rapidly changed. But inland, beyond the coastal plain, it would be almost another century before real encounters with white people. The ridges and valleys between the Great Smokies and the Blue Ridge Mountains were the heartland of one of the largest tribes in North America.
We Cherokee cannot separate our place on earth from our lives in it, nor from our vision and meaning as people. From childhood, we are taught that the animals and even the trees and plants that we share a place with are our brothers and sisters. So when we speak of land, we are not speaking of property, territory, or even the piece of ground upon which our houses sit and our crops are grown. We are speaking of something truly sacred.
Spring begins here in the valleys and creeps up the hillsides. Before the first leaves burst on the trees, the sunlit forest floor is carpeted with a variety of flowers unlike anything in Europe. Over 300 different plants were known and used by the Cherokee, some as food, but many more as medicine. In the Cherokee view of nature, everything is in intricate balance. The plant spirits, with their medicine, are allies of man. The diseases they cure come from animal spirits. For the Cherokee, as for all Native Americans, plants and animals live in the spirit world. Man must care for nature, both physical and spiritual. What he reaps is freely given, but he must make his own gift in return. To survive, the Cherokee had to hunt, but for them the animals and birds they killed for food and clothing all had a right to be respected, even in death.
Long ago, when animals could talk, they lived in villages like men do now. They knew that men had to hunt to feed themselves, but the Great Council of Animals decided that from now on, if a hunter killed an animal without showing proper respect for it, that animal would inflict the hunter with some disease. Each animal agreed in turn which disease it would inflict. All except Chipmunk, who said he had no grievance because men never hunted him. This so angered the other animals that they clawed at his back. The chipmunk still carries those scratch marks today. Yonah, the black bear, is different from these other animals. He was once a young boy who began to spend most of his time in the forest, where there was always plenty of food to eat. The more time he spent there, the more his hair grew, until eventually he became a bear. But before he did, he taught the other people a song. If this song is sung with proper respect, even Yonah will come and give his flesh for food.
The flowering of the dogwood marks the beginning of the season when most woodland birds rear their young. For the Cherokee, each species had its place, and each its use.
The blue jay starts work at dawn. If a jay's wing feather is found by accident, but not taken from a living bird, it can be soaked in water to make a potion. Such a potion can be splashed in the eyes of a child and will make him rise as early as the jay. The cardinal is called Tatsue. It means red bird. Red bird was the daughter of the sun, but was killed by two snakes, spreading adder and copperhead. Her spirit was transformed into red bird. So not everything in the world is in harmony, and some animals do not fit into their right places. Birds are creatures of the day, so those that are awake by night are to be feared. The cries of uguk are ill omens, the bird itself a witch. It was other animals that first brought light to the world. First Possum tried to bring light from the other side of the world, where there was plenty. He hid it in his bushy tail, but it burned all the fur off, and the possum's tail is still bare. All snakes are important spirits, but Awodike Askau, Copperhead, is much feared. He is descended from a great serpent and was with Spreading Adder when the daughter of the sun was killed.
Although the night forest seems populated with dangerous spirits, there are none here that are evil. The concept of good and evil was one brought by the Europeans. The Native American world is a balance between forces which help and those which bring misfortune. Even Uguk can be benevolent. He too must be allowed to rear his young, for without his children, the life of the forest would be incomplete. For the American Indian, everything in this landscape has a place in the spirit world. Every feature is imbued with life.
The river is Yonwi Ganahi, the long man. The voice of the long man is the roar of the waterfall and the murmur of the river. He speaks to those who know how to listen. Here also are the gateways to the spirit world, beneath the world of men.
In the streams of the Smoky Mountains lives the animal the Cherokee call water dog. It's a giant salamander that European settlers would later call the hellbender. This primeval-looking amphibian comes from an ancient lineage that echoes the antiquity of these mountains and their communities of plants and animals. The Cherokee towns were along these river valleys, but as summer reached the peaks, they set up temporary camps higher in the mountains from which to hunt game and to collect the fruits of autumn. The cubs of Yona the bear are now well grown. The prolific vines and briars offer a last chance to fatten up before winter forces the female and her new family back into hibernation. For the Cherokee, autumn is also a time of great renewal. The many kinds of leaves that fall in the river now endow the sacred water with powerful medicine which flows through the whole forest. The Cherokee called this land Elohwe. In their language, the same word embraces history, culture, and religion. Since their ancestors first came to these mountains, this land had not belonged to them. They had belonged to the land. The English did not see nature in the same way. They thought differently, they acted differently, they changed the land. The Pilgrims who landed in New England in 1620 came to build their New Jerusalem, the city of godliness. They and those who followed saw the Indians as savages, their religion as devil worship, and their relation with the land as ungodly. To their new world, they brought the belief that they were superior to nature, not part of it. Their duty was to tame the land, to till the soil, to dominate nature. Throughout the colony, permanent fields and towns, the mark of the English concept of civilization, replaced the constantly shifting Indian pattern of life. The European diseases which continued to wipe out entire populations of Indians just ahead of settlement were seen to be acts of God. A new orderliness would be imposed on the heathen land. As the settlers extended their territories, clearing and fencing in the land, they were recreating a piece of home in a hostile and alien land. For them, there was no value in wilderness. Their animals, their plants, their tools were shipped from Europe. And in exchange, Europe took furs and hides. The Indians now hunted animals to trade with the Europeans, and the balance of their own lands collapsed. Where there had been forests rich in wildlife, there were now only deserted beaver ponds.
Our fathers had plenty of deer and skins. Our plains were full of deer, as also our woods. But these English, having gotten our land, they with their scythes cut down the grass, and with their axes fell the trees, and we shall all be starved.
The English colonies had at last established a permanent way of life, a cause for great thanksgiving. The die was cast. The dialogue between these two worlds would continue. The newcomers were already changing the land, but as they moved westwards, they too would be changed by the nature of this vast continent.